Good evening to everyone watching this. Today, we students of the National Law School of India and editors and observers of the Law School Policy Review shall interview Ms. Shagun Bhargava and Ms. Kanupriya for their work in prison research and how Indian prisons have evolved over time. Their work shall also comprise of a comparative analysis of across prison methods and how criminology has impacted research of prison methods. My observer shall begin with introducing Shagun and Kanupriya here, and then we can begin with the questions regarding how prison methods has changed the discourse in India.
Ms. Kanupriya Sharma is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Nottingham. She has conducted extensive fieldwork and research into the subjects of criminology, specifically focusing on women's rights within prison and women's experiences within prison as prisoners. Ms. Shagun Bhargava is a research lecturer at the School of Law in BML Munjal University in India. She has earned an MPhil in criminological research from the University of Cambridge, where she studied parole decision making in Delhi, and she completed her undergraduate degree of law at Nalsar University of Law, India. Um, yeah.
Uh, Now, I'll begin with Shagun and Kanupriya, and either of them can go forth. But please tell us about your background and how do you feel, how did you gravitate towards the research of criminology and prison research? So, yeah, please begin.
Um, should I start?
Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead, Kanupriya.
Okay. So, um, so my background academically and socially and personally has fundamentally shaped how I've approached prison research in India. So I first entered a prison in 2014 as a student at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and I was conducting field work in Pune Women's Prison in Maharashtra, working on legal aid. And that experience sort of stayed with me, and it exposed me to sort of the institutional layers of incarceration in ways that the classroom could. And it made me realize how little our academic training prepares us, for the complexity of these spaces. And so shortly after, I conducted my master's dissertation in Punjab women's prison, exploring how women contemporary incarceration. And at the time, I was a very naive researcher, and I expected sort of find stories of pain, loss, stigma, and abandonment, things that we read in texts in prisons. And those stories were there and were existing in the prisons at the time. But what women offered instead were sort of stories of love, stories of joy, of solidarity, of survival. Um, and they weren't simply sort of enduring prison, they were reimagining themselves within it, and sometimes in ways that conformed to caste and patriarchal expectations, and sometimes in ways that subtly or overtly resisted them. I then moved to become like a CM fellow, but I also pursued an MPhil and PhD at Cambridge. So both in 2018 and 2020, I came back to prisons research, and where I was exposed to dominant research frameworks. Um, uh, having done a degree in Cambridge then exposed me to sort of Western frameworks of research that emphasize sort of objectivity, structure, standardization, and these frameworks were often presented as sort of neutral or universal, but they were not. And they're deeply shaped by Euro-American histories and institutions. And, they often sort of failed to imagine or accommodate what spaces of Indian prisons look like, spaces that are profoundly informal and relational and constantly sort of shifting. Um, and that sort of made me more interested in prison research because prisons in India don't lend themselves to tidy research designs, and access isn't granted through formal ethics committees or paperwork. It's negotiated through networks, trust, cultural fluency. And so all of this made me all the more interested in talking about prison methodologies and prison research frameworks. I also run the Cambridge Decolonizing Criminology Network, where we sort of talk about these issues, and we talk about research that's coming from the global south in general and from non-Western contexts. And I think my research sort of fits in very well in all of these areas. Um, I don't know if you want to talk more about my PhD research, but we could talk more about that later. But my PhD research sort of also explored women pathways to and experiences of incarceration through the lens of love, marriage, and kinship in India. And I did my ethnographic research across two states, Punjab and Rajasthan, and interviewed over 127 incarcerated women. And of course, whatever I say in the podcast today is deeply inspired by my experiences of conducting ethnographic research over a decade now. Over to you, Shagun, and then we can talk more about my experience later.
Thank you so much to Kanupriya, also to Uday and Vaishnavi for conducting this. That's a tough act to follow actually because Kanupriya just has so much experience in prisons research. And basically, your question was what brought me to this research and what is my background, right? So my undergraduate training was in law. So doing empirical research and doing prisons research was, of course, a huge detour from that because one, we don't even learn about these things in law school. We study the IPC and the CRPC, but we seldom think about what happens when one is incarcerated. We don't look at prison manuals. So those are also rules and regulations that one must or ought to look at in law school, but we seldom do. And we also approach these questions from the lens of rights perhaps or human rights violations, but we don't think about it in terms of the social life of prisons, which is what I wanted to actually learn more about. And so right after law school, I litigated, and one of the first cases that I argued independently was a parole appeal. And that's what I based my MPhil thesis on as well. My MPhil thesis was about parole decision making in Delhi. That's because, again, I practice there, I'm familiar with the language, etc., which is why Delhi. And for my MPhil thesis, I interviewed all the different parole decision makers. And parole in Delhi is actually it's very eclectic. In that the decision making process involves a bunch of interconnected institutional actors, ranging from the police to the prisons to the DG prisons, and finally the decision of whether an incarcerated convict should be given parole or not is taken by the lieutenant governor of Delhi. So we can see that it's very bottoms up in that sense. Which was very interesting. And why did I want to? What made me sort of do this research was, again, going back to when I was litigating. For this first case that I was arguing, of course, I was like, naive, and this was the first time that I was going to be in front of a judge, and I thought I'd make all of these like compelling arguments about empirical research. So I'm looking up everything. I'm trying to look things up, but I realized that there's absolutely nothing exists about parole in terms of we don't think about how many people get parole, we don't think about why these applications get rejected, etc. And I realized that's what I want to do. I want to understand this better. I want to understand the social lives of these officers better, which led me to do an MPhil in criminological research.
That's very nice to know. So I'll begin with how Shagun outlined her own background in law, and we'll notice that often criminologists come across various disciplines when they're conducting prison and field research. So yourself being one from a legal background, and Kanupriya as well, how do you feel that this legal perception which the undergraduate curriculum of law inculcates in one's mindset, do you feel the discipline which a criminologist comes from impacts how they view criminology and prison research?
Right. Kanupriya, do you want to take that first?
Um, so I'm not really from a law background. So if you actually look at my background, I did my undergraduate degree in psychology from Punjab University. Then I became a journalist. So I was working with Hindustan Times for an year, and I also did a journalism degree at the Asian College of Journalism, Chennai. So my career trajectory was is very sort of messed up in terms of discipline, but also interdisciplinary, which sort of gave me a chance to sort of expand my research in all of these directions. And after that, I came to social work, where I did my specialization in criminology and justice from TIS. And then I worked with several organizations, worked as a CM fellow, also did my MPhil and PhD in Cambridge in criminology. And that's how I picked up the specialization. So, I mean, I came to the discipline from a very interdisciplinary perspective, and that really helped me because obviously break it helped me sort of understand prisons from different sorts of lenses. Um, for me, law always existed parallelly to criminology, but many a times it is obviously sort of like thought of as something which is in law. And I think I'm a bit biased in that way that I would see criminology as a separate discipline from law. Of course, it's benefiting that, when you're doing a law degree, you learn and hear more about criminology. But I think it's time that criminology as a discipline has its own identity. Even in Cambridge and Oxford, if you see, for instance, it's under the faculty of law. So a lot of our administration stuff is under the faculty of law, whereas criminology has always sort of like struggled to find its own identity because it's sort of interdisciplinary nature. Like early criminologists were sociologists, but really not legal scholars in a true sense. And what we do is also sociology of prisons, not sort of looking at the legality of it all, but how it sort of translates in the lives of prisoners, in the lives of those involved in the criminal justice system. So I think it's important to delineate itself from law, but also see law as an important bit when we talk about criminology, because we can't separate prisoners' lives from the legal entanglement and from the law, that defines their lives. So yeah, I think Shagun would be better off in terms of explaining the career trajectory from law and criminology and how it is interdisciplinary. But for me, it just sort of came naturally from the disciplines that I was already studying, which is psychology, social work, and journalism. All of this sort of contributed naturally to the work that I'm doing now.
So, of course, because my undergraduate training was in law, that did influence what I took with me to the field. But frankly, what I wanted to take with me to the field was not the law. Why my questions were sort of influenced by the law was also because my research was extremely exploratory. Because nothing existed, I leaned on what I already knew, which was the law. And as I had litigated these cases, dealt with appeals, parole appeals, I knew certain facts about parole already. That a lot of parole orders, for instance, which are rejected and then appealed, are overturned by the judiciary. So I used that, and the thing was, when I was on the field, it was very, as Kanupriya was also saying, it's not neat and tidy at all. And for me, it was also extra messy because of the players involved, so many different institutional actors. And also because I knew so little about what is happening on the ground, my questions changed every single day. So it was evolving, and that's also, both of us are qualitative researchers, and so that means that I was doing semi-structured interviews with my participants. So my questions were sort of evolving. They started off with the law, but then as soon as I realized XYZ about their social lives, their hierarchies, what impacts their decision making, I probed in those more interesting directions which perhaps had nothing to do with the law. But the law did impact finally my thesis as well. Because of my training in the law, I do look at rules and sort of criticize them from the lens of fair, arbitrary, the words that lawyers use. So those words did make their way into my thesis, but that was not the predominant framework with which I either approached my fieldwork or my thesis. And also, just to be clear, that's something that I wanted to do when I did criminology. I wanted an interdisciplinary perspective, and I didn't want to just restrict myself to the rules.
Yeah, so one of the things which you just mentioned was how the field of criminology has various players in it, various stakeholders, for example, the courts, the lawyers, the police, and most importantly, the prisons. As you also mentioned in your introduction speech, you feel that one of the most heavily guarded aspects among criminology is access to prisons. How would you feel that access to prisons has changed over time regarding how you feel, how it has compared in practice to methods in India and abroad? We would like to see how field research has especially changed in this, especially regarding aspects of access to public prisons.
Should I begin?
Definitely, considering that they're also talking about it temporally, you are, yes.
Yeah, so like I said, I began doing prison research in 2014. Things have not changed drastically since then. Indian prisons have always been heavily gatekept when it comes to research. And gatekeeping is not just sort of bureaucratic, it's ideological. I'm not sure if you have read Karan Tripathi's article, which not an article, but it was a blog that he wrote in 2021. It's on the Oxford website. It's called Gagging Penology, structural silencing of prison research in India. And he talks exactly about access to prison research and how it's sort of an arbitrary gatekeeping. And he talks about gatekeeping through the lens of the state guidelines that were issued shortly after the banning of India's daughter. So in 2015, there were guidelines that were issued by the Supreme Court, and they were clearly designed to sort of create a chilling effect for researchers. So the 2015 advisory sort of essentially states that no private individual or organization should ordinarily be allowed into prisons for research, interviews, or documentation unless it is deemed to produce positive social impact or it's government invited. And that alone reflects a desire to sort of control the narrative and not open it to like general public, right? And even when access is sort of granted, the process is intentionally sort of like gate kept. So for instance, in that guidelines, you have that 1 lakh should be given in security deposit. And of course, we know that researchers are not very well funded. So of course, where will that 1 lakh come from? There'll be surveillance by the superintendent. So the interviews would be done in the presence of a staff from the prison. There's also a right to delete any sort of undesirable content without explanation. And the final manuscript, I mean, the final sort of transcript that you generate from your interviews, they must be submitted to the prison department for a no objection certificate. Now, these are not neutral steps. They are structurally designed to deter, intimidate, and sort of censor prison research, right? But beyond these formal restrictions, access is very arbitrary, shaped by who you are, what you're researching, where you're researching, how the system categorizes you, right? So in my case, I was studying women prisoners. All throughout the decade, I have mostly studied women in prison. And women are not typically perceived as political threats, right? And that sort of worked in my favor. But even within that, like I remember when I received sort of guidelines for my access from the Punjab department, from the Punjab Prisons Department and Rajasthan, there were explicit instructions that I must not speak to anyone who were booked under UAPA or terrorism related offenses. So clearly, the state draws lines around which, on whose voices are permissible to be heard and whose voices must remain unheard. And access, let's be very, very honest here, is also about privilege. I'm an upper caste, foreign educated Indian woman with institutional affiliations and social capital. And I was granted access during the peak of COVID when I was doing my PhD, when families even couldn't visit the prisons. And that's not normal, that's an exception. And I carry that with huge responsibility. And oftentimes I felt guilt about it, that why am I being allowed entry into prisons at a time when nobody else was allowed access? Because, and that meant not just conducting interviews. I became sort of a bridge for prisoners to the outside world. Women hadn't spoken to their families for days, sometimes weeks. Phone systems weren't working, their accounts weren't being recharged because they were shifting from an online system to from a physical system to an online system. And they would literally like request me to take their messages out. And I became sort of an unofficial courier of information. And with that came ethical dilemmas I had never imagined. So I see that my access came with a privilege. It came with jugaad. It came with paunch. It came with a lot of like pulling strings in the government. And of course, all of that comes with like social and cultural capital. And I think as researchers, we should be very honest about the way we are carrying out research, the way we are gaining access, and maintain that honesty throughout our accounts of methodological whenever we write our methodologies. So yeah, I think that's what my take on access is. But of course, it hasn't changed temporally at all. In fact, it has become more restricted. It has become more sort of gate kept, and I think it will continue to do so, especially in terms of who are we interviewing. So it depends a lot on who is that audience. Is it women? Is it trans women? Is it men? Is it political prisoners? Um, who are the people you want to interview? I think it depends a lot on that, like I mentioned earlier. Yeah, it's a long answer.
Not much is left to say, but a very excellent way of actually even picturizing access. Again, just to talk about Karan Tripaঠি's blog post again, he thinks of it, or he's quoting somebody who calls it fluffy from the Philosopher's Stone. Philosopher's
Yeah.
Stone, right?
Yeah.
From the Philosopher's Stone. You know the three-headed dog who is guarding that human, the Philosopher's Stone, quite literally. That's exactly how prisons are gate kept. And I think that's an excellent way of sort of relating to what struggles researchers face when they are trying to access the black box, which is a prison. And as Kanupriya has already said, and I can 100% agree, my access was entirely shaped and enabled by the fact that I am again an upper caste, upper class woman who has litigated in Delhi, who has certain networks in Delhi due to the socio-cultural capital that I possess in this space. Um, if it were not for that, and if I were to take the legal official route of enabling of getting access into prisons, I don't think I would have been able to do my research because the advisory is so strict, and especially and they view people from foreign backgrounds sometimes more suspiciously, again because of the context of why that advisory was rolled out in the first place in 2015 in the context of the documentary. So people coming with any sort of foreign degree, research, etc., are viewed with an added lens of suspicion. So yeah, access is something that it is not officially negotiated, and the words that Kanupriya uses are extremely key and extremely instrumental in understanding access to Indian prisons. Jugaad as well as Pohoj. Excellent way of putting it. Yeah. But
That
I also as to ask, I'm also trying to think about whether this is just an Indian problem or not, because I don't think it is. For instance, from the US, we barely have ethnographic accounts anymore, and that has been documented because, again, access is difficult to negotiate in the US. And scholars have sort of called this the fortress mentality of these institutions themselves, which makes me wonder what is so special about prisons that states across jurisdictions want to stop people like researchers who have questioning attitudes to enter these spaces. But of course, Kanupriya can also talk about that more because she has conducted fieldwork in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what you're saying, Shagun, of course, now I'm doing a research, a project exploring how resistance processes vary by ethnicity. So I'm interviewing people on probation. So I go to the probation office and interview people. And of course, access works very differently in the probation office setting because obviously it's not the prison. Of course, when you have to go to the prison, there are official protocols and documentation that you have to follow in the UK, which is you also get your background verification checked by the NRC, and there's a lot of like formal process that you have to go through, but it's all formal. Of course, I mean, they know if you are coming from Cambridge, there are some institutional affiliations that they will consider, and of course, but those are under the wraps. But the whole process in total is very formal, which is not the case in terms of in what happens in India. But in terms of the probation office, for instance, we obviously went to the upper authorities and got access, and once the top authorities are with you in terms of like your research, automatically it flows downwards, which means the probation officers are very nice to you. They are very cooperative. It also depends on where in the UK you're conducting your research as well, just like in India. Of course, I remember I got permissions to conduct research in Punjab, whereas I pulled the same amount of strings in Maharashtra, but I couldn't get permission because they said it's COVID time, and no matter what you do, you will not be allowed entry into prisons at all, and you need to wait indefinitely. And of course, as a PhD researcher, you do not have the privilege to wait because your funding is on the line. The funders wouldn't wait for you. You cannot waste your time just doing nothing or just waiting for access. You need to be in the prison, especially when you're doing prisons research. So for me, it was really important, but also it comes with institutional pressures. Like I said, like I had to complete my PhD, so I couldn't wait for the Maharashtra department to give me permissions, and Rajasthan and Punjab worked out for me. So of course, within states as well, because it's arbitrary and it is dependent on the person who is sitting on the seat, how you interact with them, how they perceive you, how they perceive the institutional affiliation that you carry with yourself. All of that makes a difference in getting access. And because I had previously gained access in Punjab prisons a couple of times before, in 2014, in 2018 as well. So of course they trusted me more with access, because nothing had happened then. So they trusted me that nothing would happen now, because I was interviewing the same set of population, which is women in prison, which I have earlier talked about is seemed as non-threatening. Um, so I think all of that makes a lot of difference. Whereas in the UK, all these factors are not taken into consideration as much. Once you've been granted access, it is, I mean, people understand you're there to do research. Everything is formalized, is set up for you in a platter and given to you that this is where you will conduct research. For instance, this is a very small example, and of course, Western researchers may argue that it sometimes is difficult, and it is complex, it is messy. Things are messy everywhere. But you do have a room where you conduct research, right? But in India, you don't get a room. I mean, there is no provision of a room. So you go in the prison, you need to just like find your own space where you want to conduct an interview. You will not be given a room to conduct an interview because there is no infrastructure for research. I mean, there is no infrastructure in the UK as well, but they would create a room for you. That's one of the small examples. For instance, I have conducted interviews on staircases in kitchens, in barracks, in nurseries, in hospital rooms, in medical clinics, in the prison van, in the Bakshishkhana, which is called the court prison, everywhere almost. But here in the UK, I do go into a room in a professional setting. They know that I'm here to do research. Like we were talking earlier as well, me and Shagun, that um, they just know what research is, right? And that makes a huge difference. And that's where your access also starts. So the access is not just entering the prison, it's also entering people's lives, right? And explaining them why you're there. So access is at different levels. And accessing prison is one of the levels that you sort of begin with, but you don't end there. So yeah.
Just to highlight like one difference, when you have official access, you have access full stop. Whereas when you have this sort of access, the kind of access that we do sometimes in our context, that access is continually sort of negotiated. It's precarious and it is contingent. I can have access one day and the next day that one prison officer may have left and I will not have access. And I faced this very interestingly in terms of RTI requests as well. I thought RTI requests and positive RTI requests, which stated that please come and inspect the records because we don't have consolidated digitized data for this. That was very interesting because that one piece of paper enabled my physical entry into the entire prison complex. Post which, of course, I also had to enter separate jails. And even there, my access to each jail was contingent and precarious upon the officer in that particular jail. So, some jails, it was very easy. They realize I am a citizen, I have exercised my right to file a right to information request. And if they have so enabled my access to the physical space of the prisons, they let me enter. However, in other prisons, they denied me access. They said, we may have said 1 month ago that you can come and access these records, but now you can't. So access is not just contingent and precarious as a researcher, but it was even contingent and precarious when I was exercising my right as a citizen of this country to view public documents. That I found extremely interesting in terms of identity and access being contingent. This is as official as access I could have gotten. But
Yeah.
even that was withdrawn at the whims and fancies of these officials sometimes.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I now remember I had permission, like written permission, to carry an audio recorder and record those interviews. But every time when I would go in a different prison, they would sometimes just say, oh, the audio recorder is not allowed. Even if I would show them like a written documentation that allows me to take an audio recorder inside prison, they would just tell me arbitrary, like one day, that no, you're not allowed to record. The other day, there will be somebody else on the seat and they would be like, okay, you can take the audio recorder. So it was very much contingent, like you said, on which spaces you're accessing, in which prisons, who is sitting, who is the security guard that day. Does that person like you? Does that person like approves of you, trusts you? Like all of those things, you're credible enough to be allowed an audio recorder inside, or to be allowed anything inside. Um, for instance, I remember sometimes that I would carry everything inside, like not of course my phone or like any electronic items, but I would be allowed to carry my tiffin, my water, my book, my pen, my everything. And sometimes I would not be allowed to carry anything, like I have to go empty-handed. So that was also like based on discretion of the security guards that were stationed that day. So yeah, and also the political environment outside. So if there's elections, for instance, that's going on, so the surveillance of the prison increases. The surveillance on you as a researcher increases as well. So it's very much also dependent on the social political atmosphere that's on the outside of prison as well.
So, in this very long conversation of what we consider access, how we believe access shapes our research in prisons, because prisons are such an excluded and isolated place where to get in you need such regulatory contacts. The Pohonch word, which was used by Kanupriya, perfectly describes how prisons are there and yet they're not there for everyone to access in general. As Shagun also identified, RTIs may or may not be subject to following, depending upon a variety of circumstances, especially subjective assessment matters and how well you know people and what people might be there for you to meet during these prisons. So, as Kanupriya previously mentioned, a lot of criminologists often originated from sociology as the sociology of prisons. So even up until in the 20th century, sociology was a male dominated field, and as we both have and you both have been typically been on the outsides as well as the insides of the system, how do you feel that being a woman has shaped your access to these prisons, notwithstanding your contacts and how prisoners have interacted to you in general regarding your privilege?
Do you want to take that first, Shagun?
Sure. Um, my access, how has it impacted my access is an interesting question. It enabled my access. That's because, and in the literature, people strategically, I have read, will position themselves as a naive young researcher woman. But that label was sort of thrust upon me by the officers that I was interacting with. And for me, it was also a unique experience because I was not researching down, I was researching up in a sense. Because I was interviewing decision makers, I was interviewing prison officers, police officers, IPS officers, and also, of course, the LG of Delhi. So, in that sense, it enabled my access because they considered me, as also Kanupriya said, women are considered harmless. They considered me harmless. But what was also interesting was that that access did not neatly sort of translate into rapport building, which is an essential bit when you are doing a qualitative interview. I have to build rapport with my participants so that they open up and let me into their inner world, tell me, give me detailed answers. And that didn't happen very neatly because all my participants were middle aged men. Um, and actually, very interestingly, Jyoti Belur, who is an IPS officer and is now an academic in the UK, and she's done her doctoral research with police officers who were obviously sort of junior to her. And she talks about this exactly, where she says that when I was on the field, I obviously, in terms of my position as an IPS officer, held a lot more power than my participants who were lower in the hierarchy of the police hierarchy essentially. But she said that despite that, my participants were, and I quote her, not quite powerless. And our participants, in that sense, hold a lot of power over us even when we are interviewing them. And I feel like my gender played a role in the power that they were trying to assert over me. In that, when I sort of, as I said, in rapport building, it made it difficult because when I asked a question, they would sometimes just like smirk or giggle a little or tell me that this is such like unserious work. Why are you even doing this? Or ask me my age and call me bacha in the middle of an interview. And so it took me a while to develop a sort of like thick skin and just wade through the interview, push these sort of remarks aside. Um, yes, so that's how gender, in one way, enabled my access, but did not translate well into rapport building.
Yeah, I mean, just like carrying, like just adding further to what Shagun has said, as a women researcher, especially like a young one, male officers often treated me as well with like a mix of like protectiveness, paternalism, curiosity. And sometimes that meant being taken more seriously. Other times it meant being patronized or even tested to see how much I could handle the rigors of research, you know. There were constant negotiations of space, tone, boundaries, polite enough to keep access because you do want to keep your access. So you can't be like rude to them, even if you are not agreeing with some of the things that they say to you, but assertive enough to be taken seriously. And it's a balancing act, of course. But for me, I think one of the things that really stayed with me was, you know, how my caste status also impacted sort of my access, not only to the prison, not only how I was treated by the prison officers, but also by the prisoners themselves. So, for instance, on one of my days in a central prison in Rajasthan, I had signed the entry register, and the guard calls me back and, you know, he tells me to sign it again. And I was confused because I had filled in all my usual details. But then he points out to this very untitled column and says, I need to like write my caste and subcaste. And I hesitated because I didn't feel comfortable putting that down. And I gently refused. And that's when he looked up and down at me and he says, why? Are you from a lower caste? Because you don't look like one. And then when he saw my Aadhaar card, which he insisted on seeing, and saw my surname, which was Sharma, his entire tone sort of shifted. And suddenly, you know, he called me, oh, you're a Pandit. You're one of our own. And within seconds, the gates opened, a cup of tea was offered. I was ushered in with this like performative respect. And that moment was very uncomfortable. But more than that, it was very revealing because it showed me very early on that my caste identity wasn't just like passively present in the field, it was shaping how I was moving through it. And in Rajasthan, unlike Punjab, I mean, Punjab, the caste was present, but not so much. Caste became like the dominant lens through which I was seen. And my caste, along with my English speaking ability, my foreign educated background, and that sort of smoothened a lot of my bureaucratic hurdles as well. I got access faster, permissions were granted more easily, I was treated very differently in certain prisons. In fact, in one of the prisons, I remember the superintendent even offered me her seat to sit because she was from a lower caste. So that was how much caste was prominent in all of my interactions. Um, in terms of how the prisoners responded to me, women from upper caste spoke to me freely, but there were others who were visibly very hesitant. I remember there was one woman from like a denotified community, a denotified tribe, and she told me that she cannot be seen sitting next to me in the officer's room because she's from a lower caste, and asked me to meet during like work hours when nobody would be watching. And that really hit me. I started paying sort of closer attention to how women positioned themselves during group conversations as well. And how certain women would sit at the back of the room, how they would sit down when I'm sitting on the chair, or they would insist I don't sit on the ground with them. And that discomfort was very sort of visible because these aren't just like sort of habits, they're deeply ingrained sort of survival strategies also, right? And that's when I realized my presence wasn't sort of neutral. And no matter how well intentioned I was, I carried my caste class identity with me all on my body, and it shaped every interaction I had. So I had to be sort of deliberate. And deliberately sometimes moved interviews out of officers' room into courtyards, into their areas, like I said, into barracks, places where women felt more at ease. And I remember in one of the prisons, I also sort of conducted English language classes. And I even then the caste dynamics were very sort of visible, where you know people from certain caste would sit at the back while people from upper caste would sit in the front. So all of that was very, very visible. And so for me, caste sort of spoke more than my gender. And in Punjab, it was very interesting because my foreign education status and my NRI status was taken a lot into consideration because, you know, there's obviously an obsession in the Punjabi community to be like outside India. So everyone from jail staff to prisoners wanted to know what it was like to live in the UK. And that sparked sort of genuine curiosity. It made it easier to develop a rapport as well. Women asked about my life in London, food, weather, marriage abroad. And, you know, they were like really thrilled that, you know, a foreign educated person or somebody who's an NRI in their eyes has actually come into the prison to speak to them. So everything, sort of my positionality influenced by my identity, caste, gender, language, urban background, foreign education, class shaped every single interaction.
So, one of the things which we just talked about was how prisoners personally react to criminologists who also come from various sections of society. So, you mentioned Karan's work and how the contact and reaching out to prisoners often depends upon a variety of factors. Do you feel, again, this is again, I'm harking back to one of the original tenets of criminology, which seeks not to re traumatize the prisoner who's sought to be interviewed. Again, reliving painful experiences regarding crime can often be emotional for the people who are interviewing them, but at the same time, the criminologist has to be careful that they do not risk re traumatizing the very victim who they've sought to interview. So, would you balance that with how privilege and access goes forward in prisons? And would you say that your personal experience regarding how what might cause re traumatization in various forms of prisoners. For example, Kanupriya talks about women prisoners in general, across all castes. So, would you feel that your own access and privilege may have risked that? And what, if not, what might have the potential to aggravate that very risk? Either of you can go first.
I feel like only Kanupriya can answer this question. So, Kanupriya, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, because I have mainly worked with obviously women in prison who come from very traumatic histories and traumatic backgrounds, and often they are victims of domestic violence or like have seen a lot of violence in their lives. And I mean, I don't know how to answer this question because I feel like it was traumatizing for me as well as a researcher. So, to be very honest and open, of course, I was going through a very difficult marriage at a time when I was doing my field research as well. I was just newly married. There were a lot of things that I was figuring out in my married life as well. And whatever I was hearing from the women was actually also happening in a way in my life as well. So in terms of like the constraints of marriage, in terms of like subscribing to those patriarchal and caste norms, all of this that as women we see when we enter a married life. And I think it was like a particularly sort of, no, I would not say interesting, but like a particularly sort of a particular time when I was entering the prison, when I was also not feeling comfortable myself with what was going around in my personal life. And it almost affected my fieldwork, and the fieldwork affected my personal interactions with my family members as well. And I think I document that in my methodology a lot because I think um, for both me and my participant, the research became sort of like a safe space. So I don't know if they were re traumatized, but a lot of women did confess to me that they thought this was the most cathartic experience that they've had in a while, and that they have never had the opportunity to talk about their lives in such open, raw, and honest forms the way they're able to do it with me. Especially, I was entering the prison, like I said, at a time when their family visits were suspended. So I was the only outsider they could actually meet, the only outsider who was actually also sometimes carrying messages from them to their family members. So I wasn't just a researcher. Sometimes I would be like a friend. Sometimes I was a sister to them. Sometimes I was their daughter. Sometimes I was a support worker. So I had to like not just be a researcher. So I think those boundaries were quite blurred. And I think that also helped me to sort of negotiate, you know, I wouldn't call it like just rapport, my relationship with them, because it wasn't just a researcher participant relationship. And a lot of them still are in touch with me, still are in contact with me. We've formed bonds for life. And these are not just like researcher participant relationship that Western research sort of talks about. When I say Western research time and again, that's because that's where most of the sort of methodological writings come from. But I mean, there is this power in making these kinship networks and ties when you are in the field. And I think because I was also going through a troubling time, the prison also became a safe space for me. I was like, prison was the only place I could go to during COVID, especially when I need to go outside, because obviously for us as well, the pandemic happened and there was sort of lockdown and restrictions. So I was going from my place to the prison, and for the prisoners, I was the only sort of like outlet. So I think that changed the whole researcher participant dynamic for me, and I think that was such a powerful time to do research as well. And I think I carried so much with me, like such weight and such responsibility and such accountability, because I was given the privilege to access prisons at a time when nobody could. And I had the power to sort of take their voices outside. And I'm really sort of, sometimes I found the phrase giving voice a bit troubling, because it assumes that people that are incarcerated don't already have one, but they do. And in fact, they have incredibly rich, complex, emotionally layered ways of expressing themselves. And it's that the world often refuses to listen to them. So my role was not to give them voice, but to create space for that voice to be heard, and to make sure I'm not distorting it in the process. So a lot of times in my writing, if you happen to read my PhD thesis, I'm very intentional about my work. For example, I'm very conscious about how I translate people's words. So I have kept some of their original phrases in Hindi or Punjabi. um, I don't want to over sanitize or over translate what they were saying just to fit academic norms. So there was a rawness, a texture to their word that carries so much meaning. So I try to retain that throughout the writing. Um, Also, there's a tendency of italicizing words in Hindi or Punjabi, and sort of italicizing them in like academic texts. I have refused to do that throughout my PhD writing. So if you look at, if you read my thesis, you would see that I haven't italicized any of the Hindi, Punjabi, or colloquial words that I use. I have kept them as we keep the English language. So in sort of these practices, I have really sort of tried wherever possible to sort of keep their voices intact and to present it the way they were presented to me. I've also tried to sort of go back to my participants after analyzing their stories. For instance, I would sometimes go to some of them to ask, did I understand you correctly? Does this feel accurate? And that wasn't always like formal. It was a casual follow-up conversation during a later visit. But it was important for me to understand that the way I've interpreted their interviews or their conversations with me is the way they wanted their voices to come out. Because interpretation is always an act of power, right? And I didn't want to assume authority over someone else's experience or voice. Um, so I think, yeah, that's again my long answer to your question.
Perhaps, Shagun, you could also walk through how balancing this imperative to provide voice to the incarcerated individuals who are often thought not to have a voice is also seen in light with how re-traumatization and getting the prisoner to open up also comes across. You're muted.
Sorry. Because I haven't interviewed or worked with incarcerated populations, I don't think I'm suited to answer that question. It's because I interviewed prison officers, and yeah, I was in the physical space around incarcerated people, but just not, I didn't get an opportunity to. And my research question was such that I didn't have to interview, speak to um, incarcerated people.
That's okay as well. So perhaps we could move across to what we've both seen how privilege, access, and re-traumatization suffers across in prisons. Another aspect which I can think of is what problems do prisoners feel are underrepresented by both prison authorities as well as criminologists. For example, I can think of the Tihar example where we see a local form of a prison economy run across by prisoners where they play across various roles in both in prison and outside. So it operates not just in isolation with how the economy works outside the prison, but it also facilitates an inner mechanism of how prisoners can support their needs despite being away from their families. So, while examples of such a prisoner economy may not be very prevalent across many prisons, considering how it was the first kind of an experiment run across in India, do you feel various prison experiments which may be run across by either the prison authorities or criminologists in general? Do you think these experiences change how the prisoners look themselves in the wider scheme of things regarding criminology?
Hear you.
I'm sure you could hear me for most of the part. Could you please tell me where I lacked off?
Could you just summarize your question because I could not hear you in bits and pieces.
So basically, we see various kinds of experiments run across, such as the Tihar experiment, where we see local forms of prison economy where prisoners can support themselves despite not being considered a mainstream part of what actually contributes to society. So there are various experiments such as work for labor. For example, prisoners can often choose to work for a fund basis. So do you feel these experiments, which may either be run by prisoner authorities or by criminologists in general, do you think they change how the prisoners view themselves regarding the wider scheme of things in society?
Just to quickly like sort of clarify a few things. Working in prisons is not something that everyone can sometimes opt to do, and this is something that came up a lot of times in my research because I wanted to. One, a person has to be given rigorous imprisonment for them to be given work in prisons. Secondly, because our prisons are so extremely overpopulated, taking the Tihar example, if a prison has a sanctioned strength of perhaps 1,000, there are 5,000 inmates in that prison, right? Given, oh God, can you hear me?
Yeah, we
This is
can hear you,
excellent.
but
Yeah, but
we can hear you, but we can barely see you.
yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you, Shagun. Yeah, but yeah, your screen has gone black.
Can you see me now, sort of,
Yeah,
till my
yeah.
light comes back? I'm going to appear like a ghoul, but it's fine. Yeah, so given that our prisons are so overpopulated, only some prisoners even get to work. And how officials make that decision is super interesting. One, it can be sanctioned by the in the judgment. So a judge will go like, this person should get work because he has committed X kind of offense, rigorous imprisonment. That has a very interesting colonial history. So it's not always a positive thing that a person's getting to work in a prison. Firstly, one that. Secondly, and who the official picks is also dependent on one, the kind of offense that you may have committed. Secondly, the kind of behavior or your conduct in prison, and how you behave or your conduct is obviously a perception of the officer himself or herself or themselves, right? So this whole idea of working in prison, etc., is not always very positive. And it's also something that is constructed and it leads to things as well. For instance, if I work in prison, my conduct is looked upon as favorable by, for instance, privileges such as parole or furlough. So if I've worked in prison, I am more likely to perhaps get parole or furlough because I'm then seen as a person who is not very risky because I've already done work in prisons. I've worked with my inmates. I have behaved well in those aspects of prison life, and hence I am a deserving candidate for privileges such as privileges. They are not rights. Privileges such as parole and furlough. So it's complicated. Who gets to work in these populated prisons and how the privilege of working translates to further privileges, which are more important and should not be contingent on something like getting to work in prison.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's very nicely put, Shagun. I think um, it is contingent on a lot of factors and caste as well, like we have mentioned before. But in the case of women, it was also a lot to do with the moral nature of their offenses, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So, for instance, if you are in for sex trafficking, right, you would be considered like fighting the act. You would be considered immoral because you were indulging in like sex work, uh, so which was not looked by the authorities as a very sort of moral offense to begin with. So you would not get work in sort of like administrative departments, or you can't work as a writer, you can't work, in the clinic, or like you can't hold these like sort of honorable work positions in the prison. Whereas if you are, for instance, a long time offender and you had murdered your husband, but in response to domestic violence, there would be some amount of sympathy towards you by the prison administration, and they might appoint you to these positions, which they call sort of trustworthy positions in terms of their sort of normal day-to-day language. And they would give it to a trustworthy person. Now, who is a trustworthy person is obviously subjective, because it involves a lot of documentation, it involves handling sensitive documents, so they wouldn't give it to just anybody. So there needs to be some sort of criteria of who they should give it, and that criteria is obviously up to the discretion of the jailer or the superintendent, and how you're perceived in prison, what your offense is, for how much time are you in prison, because they would obviously want long-term offenders to be taking these positions, not somebody who would be out in like 4 months, because that wouldn't serve their purpose as well. So it's very political, it's very morally laden, and these things are very much sort of understood by the prisoners as well. In comparison to women and men as well, male prisoners have more opportunities to work because it's a larger prison. Women do not have the same opportunities at all because they are sort of stuck in a prison inside a prison. So that's what we call a women's prison, right? Because most of the women's prisons do not have their own buildings. They are they are put in a building which is largely constructed for men, and then they are put into like four barracks. So the four barracks are sort of sanctioned off for women. So how do you expect women to get any kind of jobs in that sort of an infrastructural setup? Of course, they are then left to do like mundane jobs, like sometimes cutting vegetables, for the larger catering, or sometimes just like very sort of, I don't know, gendered jobs. For instance, sometimes they would like um, do the cooking if there's a major event happening, because women cook well. um, so all of these sort of jobs would be given to women instead of men, whereas the main kitchen would always be in the male prison section. So the main food would always be cooked by men, but when the events would happen, there's anything special happening, then it would be given to women. So these are sort of very sort of, so when we talk about like initiatives in prison and reform initiatives, who are these reforms for, and for what purpose is the question that we should be asking. um, and I think
Just
prison research in India, yeah, yeah, of course, Shagun, please.
No, no, I was just going to give an example about the class and caste thing because during my interviews, what came up was whatever you do outside, we expect you to do inside. So, for instance, if you were an engineer, we'll give you a job in the administrative wing, which is obviously a very coveted job because you're sitting in an AC room and working on a computer. So, your class identity translates from the inside or carries from the outside into the inside as well. And even in terms of caste, we all know about Sukanya Shanta's research and now obviously the judgment that it has led to. Caste and what society expects you to do outside prison is also what in a lot of Indian prisons is expected from you inside. So your class and caste and gender shape what kind of work, if any, you are given access to.
Absolutely. And I think prison research in India generally is still sort of quite, it's not new, but it's quite sort of nascent. um, for instance, most of the research, if you see, is through the lens of policy analysis, like things like implementation failures, infrastructural deficiencies, overcrowding, lack of hygiene, or understaffing. And don't get me wrong, those are real urgent issues. But so much of the work stays at the level of like systemic critique without engaging deeply with the lived experiences of those actually occupying these spaces. So people in custody, especially women, trans women, caste marginalized communities. And there's still a real hesitation around qualitative, narrative based, or ethnographic work in Indian prison research. And 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 people often treat such methods as too subjective, too soft, or even risky, right? But without those stories, without voices from the inside, we are left with this one dimensional picture of what the prison is, that is a dysfunctional building. And that's not what prison is. It's a world, it's a moral universe, it's a site of negotiation, resistance, survival, memory, and sometimes even care and solidarity. But you only see what you are listening when you are listening to the people inside, right? So there's a disciplinary bias at play as well, because a lot of prison work still comes from sorry to say, legal scholarship, which often focuses on rights, violations, reform, but not always on how things are felt and perceived by those inside the system. How does a woman make sense of her sentence? What does honor or shame mean inside prison? How do caste hierarchies get reproduced in everyday routines? These questions are rarely prioritized, and that's a blind spot. So for me, the biggest gap isn't just what we study in prisons, but also how. We need more grounded, culturally sensitive, emotionally attuned work, ethnographic work. We need methods that allow for uncertainty, contradiction, and take seriously the knowledge that incarcerated people hold about the systems they're caught in. So I think that's what I think prison research should do.
So, among all of these issues which we have been able to identify so far, I think all of us would agree that prisons to a large extent need reform. And such reform is driven from both the government side. For example, we see the call for prison reforms in law commission reports. We see the call for prison reforms by various criminologists as well as sociologists who feel that, again, for example, Angela Davis's work is very seminal in how we define American prisons and why such sites of isolation and punishment often end up not solving crime but instead become something else entirely altogether. So, when we talk about reforming Indian prisons, how do you feel that criminologists like yourself and work like how women in prisons or sex trafficking in prisons, how do you feel such work can contribute towards the larger scheme of improving prisons in India as well as abroad?
Do you want to take that, Shagun, first?
So basically, just to confirm, your question is how does our research contribute to prison reform?
Not just yours, but again, the field itself in general and
Technologists.
statutory reforms.
That's a big question. How does our research and the research of criminologists, if it gets picked up, how does it make a impact, if at all? I have found that very difficult to do with my research, especially because, as Kanupriya was saying, qualitative research is seldom understood by policymakers or lawyers. It's dismissed as just words and feelings and emotions, and they'll ask what lawyers understand or what policy people understand better is numbers. So that somewhat still will can be picked up by a judge, hard facts, numbers. Experiences and the kind of research that we are doing as qualitative researchers is actually, in my opinion, very hard to translate into policy changes, because it is not simply not understood perhaps by a wider audience other than researchers or people who are trained in the social sciences. So that's what I think. That's the reason why I think that it's difficult sometimes for criminologists who are social scientists and not lawyers to get their work to to make sure that their work makes some change in prison reforms. And also, I feel like this whole concept of prison reform, again, as lawyers, we tend to think about it in terms of reform. But like, what does reform mean? Where do we start from? What is the most important kind of reform that one must look at? For instance, during my research, I realized that because I was again researching decision makers, people who are considered oppressors themselves. And my research revealed in a way that they are also oppressed and vulnerable in various ways. So then reform does not just simply extend to those incarcerated, but also the who we as lawyers especially villainize as the oppressors. So a lot of things need to be reformed, which is why the conclusion to my thesis was I didn't know where to start and where to end it, because I feel like that's a very big conversation about reform and what it even means and to whom. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an important question, and honestly, something that I've asked myself so many times. So, remember now, when I was a Gates scholar, and when I gave my interview for the Gates scholarship, one of the questions I always ask is, how does your research translate into impact, or what does it contribute to society? And that's always the first question that they would ask. Um, and I always struggled to answer this. And even then, when I gave my interview, I said that the only thing that I can see is that through this degree, through my academic research, I'll have more weight. I mean, my voice will carry more weight. And I think as academics, we need to often ask ourselves what happens to our research after it's written? Who reads it? Who does it serve? And I think one of the biggest challenges with prison research or any academic research really is that it rarely finds its way into the hands of people who can make concrete policy or any sort of reform or legal changes. There's still a big gap between the world of scholarship and the world of governance. Research is being done, but it's not always being read by policymakers, let alone shaping reforms. And I don't think that's just the fault of the state or the government. I think as researchers, we also need to ask ourselves, are we writing in the ways that are accessible? Are we building relationship with institutions that can use this knowledge? For me, it's about finding those points of connection, collaborating with state departments, regulatory bodies, and prison staff where possible, taking your research back to them. And I've had moments in the field where jail staff were sort of genuinely curious about the findings, right? They would ask me what other women had said, what I was observing. And those informal sort of exchanges matter because they plant these conversation plant seeds and they make people think about the system from another lens. But I also think structural change needs to happen. Academics, especially those working in prisons, should be meaningfully involved in all of these discussions, policy review committees, in training development for correctional staff, for instance, and not just in prisons. This applies across different criminal justice institutions. We need research to inform how the state designs rehabilitation programs, how it manages re-entry support for prisoners, or even trains prison staff, probation officers. And that said, I also think we need to be a little bit humble about impact. Change is slow, it's political. The Indian penal system, with all its bureaucracy and ideological layers, doesn't shift easily, doesn't change easily. So for me, it's right now, it's also about doing the work with integrity, making it public where I can, making it accessible for people to read, writing in ways that honor the voices I have engaged with, and staying open to different forms of impact, right? Maybe it's a policy change, maybe it's just one official seeing something differently, maybe it's a student rethinking what justice means and what prison means. And I think that too matters. So I think we need to also broaden our perspective about change and impact.
Shagun, would you like to add to that?
Uh,
Any, see again, this was, we'll be concluding on this. So, would you like to conclude on any other remarks on what legal reforms we might be missing in criminology?
no, I think Kanupriya has ended on an excellent note in terms of bringing about change and widening our definition and imagination of change, especially as lawyers. And that took me a while to unlearn as well. For instance, when I started my thesis, I wanted it to be a quantitative one because I thought it's going to, like, I wanted to make change in a very particular way. I wanted judges to be able to access my thesis and be able to tell, because that's also the question that I started with: what's happening on the ground, how many people are getting parole, how many are not getting parole, and why. And yeah, so I wanted it to be communicated in a sense that could be picked up and used empirically. um, but that evolved, that understanding evolved with time, and how I approached that question and answered that question, and the methods that I used to answer that question changed. And I completely agree with Kanupriya in that we need to think about our role as researchers, especially in how we communicate to wider audiences as social scientists. And I think this podcast was an excellent way of doing that, because we got to talk about our research in, I think, in a fairly accessible way, in fairly accessible language. And I hope this helps debunk some sort of like myths about doing prisons research, and also the inner life of prison. And because these are black boxes that we often don't think about as law students or as lawyers,
Yeah, I mean,
or
very right.
genuinely as even like as citizens. I think it's an excellent introduction to the kind of research that one does, how one does it, and what are some things that are important to think about.
Yeah, I think also this kind of work can only happen when the state also starts seeing research not as a threat, but as like a tool for reflection, when access isn't treated as a favor, It is a part of a democratic process. And when institutions start recognizing that researchers, especially those working from a place of care and rigor, can play a meaningful role in transforming how we think about punishment and justice, I think change will happen. And I really hope the field opens up. I hope we see more young scholars like yourself telling stories, doing this important work, challenging the academic canon as well. Because until now, prison research in India has been very small and often isolated, overly sanitized, but it has so much potential. And we do read works of scholars that have so much to contribute to this field. And we need to just start listening to the stories that are already there, just waiting to be taken seriously.
Thank you so much for joining us, Shagun and Kanupriya. We'll be uploading this on our platforms, and we're very, very glad to have you again.
Yeah, it
Thank
was
you
a
so much
pleasure.
for
Thank you.